Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah with ONN. Thanks so much for joining us. We are just allowing everyone to log in and get ready for our election rules focused webinar. We'll start right at 12 o'clock. And in the meantime, we'd like to do a quick poll of people joining us and to find out what part of Ontario you're joining us from. Great, and we're just going to put the poll up now so that we can see. And what part of Ontario are you joining us from? Great. Okay, and for those of you just joining us today, I'm Sarah with ONN. Thank you very much for being part of our webinar. We have a quick poll on screen, as you can see, to find out where people are joining us from in the province. We'd love to know. And we'll get started in just a few minutes with our webinar and our 4 presenters today. All right, so let's see where our webinar attendees, where you're joining us from. Great, good. So it's really great to see that we have folks from our network coming from different parts of the province, and even a quarter of you are coming from outside of Ontario. So here our network expands. All right, thank you. And then another poll question while we're waiting for everyone to join us. Let's go to the second, and that next question is about advocacy and what you're doing. So is your nonprofit or charity planning to engage in this federal election period? Wow, that's a big group. It's looking like with our, as I see our responses, there's a very big group that are of you who are already planning to do work. So that's great. It's very timely, and we'll get to all the interesting laws, regulations, guidelines, and then we'll get into some really good examples of what charities and nonprofits are doing this election period. All right, and we'll share the results of that. So already 64% of you are doing that. Excellent. And we'll go to the next poll question. All right, and we're curious, how are you planning to advocate if you're doing something? What activities are you planning with your organization, with your members, with your communities? Okay, excellent. And this is going to be really telling, talking about sharing information, and especially if we're thinking about sharing on social media, etc., to your members through perhaps your email lists. We'll definitely be covering what are those guidelines for you to be aware of this election, but that's fantastic to know that you're already planning to do that. Okay, good. And then one more question before we start. All right, and looking at the previous work that you've done, have you ever done activities during an election period? All right, and let's share that response. So it looks like overwhelmingly, most of you have done some kind of activities, and a lot of you are planning for this upcoming election or this season now that we're in it. And that's great for our presenters to know as well, to know that we have I'm sure, a very savvy group of organizations and community focused members who are planning to do this. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so first, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for elections in the nonprofit sector. What are the rules anyway? This has been an interesting webinar to put together. It's very timely and some of the rules are changing. So we're really lucky to have legal counsel with us from Fasken and Carter's to speak to what those rules are, but also most importantly, not to be afraid to be engaged this election period. My name is Sarah. I'm the Director of Communications and Engagement here at ONN. And if you don't know ONN, if you're new to us, welcome. It's great to have you. We're the provincial network for Ontario's 58,000 nonprofits and charities across the province, and we focus on policy, advocacy, and services to strengthen your organizations. If you're already a member of ONN, thanks so much for your support. And if you enjoy this webinar and you're not yet a member, we'd love for you to join. Also wanted to note that any technical difficulties during the webinar, if it's a visual lag or something, please just close your browser and start it up again. Hopefully GoToWebinar is a very easy platform to use for you. And any questions you might have, you can direct them to our staff here at ONN. They're here waiting to help you to make sure that you can enjoy the webinar fully. All right, so let's get started with that in mind. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the land that we are on here at ONN. For ONN, we recognize that we are on the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and that this land has been stewarded by Indigenous peoples for time immemorial, including the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. We also recognize that Toronto is part of the Métis homeland and is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. So we appreciate and we value the opportunity to do our work on this land. I'd like to next go to our fantastic lineup of speakers. We've got 4 speakers who are bringing their experience and their passion for the nonprofit sector to this webinar to share what they're doing. And first, I'll start off with Terry Carter. He is the managing partner of Carter's, and he is also counsel to Fasken on charitable matters. He's a member of the CRA Advisory Committee on the Charitable Sector, which has been newly formed. You may know Terry. He's written numerous articles and is a frequent speaker on legal issues involving charity and not-for-profit law. You may have read some of his, or been to rather, the annual Church and Charity Law Seminar, and also their major annual event, which is coming up next month. Our next speaker will be Kyle Morrow, from associate at Fasken. And Kyle's background is certainly very intensive in terms of what he's worked on, public policy and politics. His focus is on political law, and he's bringing for us today his expertise in terms of compliance at all levels of government in the areas of lobbying, conflicts of interest, campaign finance, even anti-bribery and corruption, and procurement integrity. So we're really happy to have Kyle with us today. Bill Shaper is here, the Director of Public Policy for Imagine Canada. We do lots of work with Imagine Canada, as you I'm sure have seen in our different communications and events, and we're thrilled to have him here. Bill will bring a really helpful perspective on the sector and what we can do, but also in that realm of what are those activities that we can do and what has been done already that will be useful, hopefully, for your work going forward. And Kate Cornell is co-chair. She wears 2 hats coming to this webinar today, co-chair of the Canadian Arts Coalition and the executive director of the Canadian Dance Assembly. And Kate is an arts advocate and writer based here in Toronto, but she advocates nationally for the coalition and working with the Dance Assembly. Does a lot of media work and also with using her communications and culture PhD for advancement of the art sector, especially in the sector, and advocacy. She's got some fantastic examples of what she's working on, both nationally, but also in terms of working annually as well on different activities. So we'll hear from her soon. All right, so moving along to our agenda, we'll give a little bit of context as to why we're doing this today, then move into the context for registered charities, thinking about third-party election laws next, working with Imagine Canada to identify what are those ways that we can advocate, and then examples of why and how we advocate, followed by a Q&A panel. Also, most importantly, in terms of our context, we want to be sure that we're talking about lots of rules and guidelines and several different laws, the Income Tax Act, the Elections Act. So please stick with us. We've got two legal experts to help us cover this, to help us understand. But most importantly, we really want you to, while you understand the rules, that we're not intimidated by them as a sector. We are stronger together. We don't want the sector to sit this election out. So being informed and getting information on how to advocate and what rules and regulations you need to be aware of is the first step. So it's great that you're here. So let's get started. In terms of what does it matter for nonprofits and charities to be involved, I think that it's very important that our organizations are an important bridge, remember that we are an important bridge connecting government to the people who are affected by government policy. So we're not working in pockets, the impact is felt, and especially the impact on your organization, perhaps in your day-to-day work, but also on your communities. This election is especially important. There are some major public policy issues that parties and candidates are talking about, working on, providing some information in their platforms, but these are issues that our sector is already working on, from affordable childcare, affordable housing, climate change, truth and reconciliation. So we want to be at the forefront of these conversations. And then another sort of prompt for being active during an election period or any time are sort of 4 reasons why advocacy helps you or impacts your work. And certainly public policy does impact our organizations, no matter what level we're working at or who we're working with. And to be able to make that public policy change, make it better, and to make those changes at a systems-wide level, we need to be advocates. It empowers communities as well to be involved, and it will help you meet your mission. So that's our plug for why. Let's get into the how and what we need to be aware of. I'm going to turn it over to Terry next and to talk about the Income Tax Act and impact on charities.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a delight to be with you today. And I'm going to try to cover in about 8 minutes the information that we think is important. Sarah, if I can get the next slide. That's important for you from the standpoint of charities. So Sarah, can you advance to the next slide? Thanks. So we're going to be dealing with registered charities. Later on, Kyle and Bill will be talking about the Election Canada Act with regards to both charities and nonprofits. Sarah, next slide, please. So the focus, what I want to talk about is dealing with what the Income Tax Act has to say about what charities can do and can't do. In this context, charities have to focus on a charitable purpose and carrying out charitable activities. And we've had some problems in the past concerning what charities can do with regards to political activities. The good news is there was an amendment to the Income Tax Act back in December of last year, and it removed the limitation on charities involved in political activities that had been tied into 10% of the resources. And there was also a requirement that those activities be incidental and ancillary. And fortunately, that's gone. However, the prohibition on charities being involved in direct or indirect support or opposition of any political party or candidate for public office remains. And to keep our time short, I'm going to refer to that as being prohibited activities, just to keep it short. What the legislation did introduce, however, is what charities can do, and charities can be involved now in public policy dialogue and development activities that are carried on in furtherance of a charitable purpose. And I'm going to refer to that as PPDDA or PADAS to be short, and that's what Canada Revenue Agency refers to it. What the notes to the legislation talked about is that charities can be involved in PADAS without any type of limitation in relation to quantum. Next slide, please. What the legislation does do, which is very helpful, is indicate that when a charity is involved in PADAS, i.e. public policy, dialogue, and development activities in pursuit of its charitable purpose, that's considered to be in furtherance of its purposes as opposed to any other purpose. So there's no sort of misunderstanding that that could be a political purpose associated with it. The legislation did not define what PADAS are, although the notes to the legislation did indicate that PADAS, quote, generally involves seeking to influence the laws, policies, or decisions of a government, whether in Canada or in a foreign country. And this helps to follow what the CRA consultation report that came out in May of 2017 had recommended. Sarah, next slide, please. So the next part of the background is to take a look at what Canada Revenue Agency has produced in the form of a guidance. It was released in January of this year. It was marked as draft. I think at this point it's pretty well become sort of the established guidance. And it's a very good document, and I'd recommend that if you haven't taken a look at it, you certainly should, because it explains what public policy is, meaning the law, policies, or decisions of a government in Canada or a foreign country. It explains that PADAS are the activities of the charity to participate in public policy development process or facilitating the public's participation. And the guidance also explains, similar to what the legislation notes had said, that PADAS can include seeking to influence the laws, policies, or decisions of a government, whether in Canada or in a foreign country. So there are no limitations with regards to the amount of resources that a charity can put towards PADAS. Next slide, please. The main limitation to that, of course, is that PADAS have to be done in furtherance of the charity's stated purposes, charitable purposes. So if you haven't taken a look at what your purposes are, do that, because you may find that you may want to help to update your purposes. You have to get CRA approval for that if you do. But everything comes back to your purpose. That's the key factor that you have to deal with. You have to make sure that your purpose is not tied into a political purpose, i.e. if you're eliminating human trafficking, is that your purpose, then you can't have as part of it that you want to change the law. That can be what you do, but it can't be part of what your stated purpose is. And you also have to make sure that your PADAS are being done for a public benefit or not tied in, for instance, to a private benefit. One caveat, you do need to track what you're doing with PADAS. Books and records are important. When you do your T3010, your annual return, you're going to be required to explain what you're doing with regards to your PADAS and tie it back into your purpose. So that's what you can do. That's a good news story. I think that's a huge improvement for the charitable sector. On the prohibition side, same as what we had before, the prohibited activities remain. And it's important in that regard to be familiar with what the Canada Elections Act has to say. For instance, when it talks about you cannot be directly or indirectly supporting or opposing a political party or candidate for public office, you will want to take a look at what the Canada Elections Act has to say about a candidate, when a person becomes a candidate, and just a little bit of a heads up, it's when when there's confirmation of filing the nomination papers. So you have to see it in the broader context. Next slide, please. So with regards to what you can't do in prohibited activities, the guidance, and again, this is all taken from the guidance, does give some examples of what direct support or opposition would include. Things that are fairly obvious. You can't endorse a candidate on social media or tell the charity, or put on their charity's website that you cannot not to vote for a particular political party, making a donation to a political party or candidate, or allowing your premises to be used without proper compensation. Some examples of indirect support and opposition is really looking to see what the intent is of the charity. So you have to be careful about your internal documentation, because CRA and an audit can take a look at it. If to see that your real intent was to oppose a political party or a candidate that can be problematic. Next slide. It's also important to make sure on your website, if you are taking comments on blogs and so forth, to make sure you monitor it and put a message up that you will take down any comments that are supporting or opposing a political party or candidate. And some examples of what you can do, communicating about policy issues, even if they're the same policy issues as a political party, is perfectly fine. It's what you do as a charity as opposed to what a political party has to say. So there is some breadth that's in the guidance concerning that. And you can also inform the public about positions of political parties or candidates, provided that you're neutral concerning that. And some examples are set out in the materials there. Next slide, please. If you do happen to have employees, particularly senior individuals within the charity that want to get involved themselves from a political standpoint, that's okay, but you have to be careful to make sure that you're distinguishing between what the individual is doing and what the charity is doing, and to put up disclaimers in place. Bit of a challenge if you're on social media, but you need to, as an individual or representative of the charity, make sure that you're not speaking on behalf of the charity when you're making your own position known as an individual. Next slide, please. And the last thing I want to say is it's important to see these issues on a holistic basis. It's important to make sure that you're aware of lobbying legislation, which we're not talking about today because of shortness of time, and of course about the Canada Elections Act. So what I've explained to you is under the Income Tax Act. That's one layer. Now we'll go on to the next layer of dealing with what are the requirements under the election legislation. So Sarah, turn it back over to you, and that's within 8 minutes.
That was fantastic, Terry. You promised that and you delivered. Thank you very much. And it's really great to see that we can be calm about this. There isn't any kind of panic in terms of what we can do. I really appreciate that plain language explanation too of how the ITA impacts registered charities. So thanks very much, Terry. And I will turn it over to Kyle at Fasken to talk about election rules at the federal level in terms of election laws. Over to you, Kyle.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Terry. And I'm very honored to be with everyone today. I'm just going to start off by saying we're not going to touch on lobbying law today in the presentation. I'm going to focus on election law and specifically the Canada Elections Act. But just so that you're aware that after the election, if you are communicating with people who are elected or civil servants within the government, you're likely subject to lobbying statutes. So you'll want to double check to make sure that you're complying with them. So I'll start on the first slide here. So just the next slide there. There we go. So Bill C-76, which many of you will have heard, came into effect on June 13th. And Bill C-76 changed the Canada Elections Act. Previously, only election advertising was regulated, so advertising that occurred in the election period. There was two changes that were brought in. One, there were activities and surveys which were not originally covered, which were brought into the legislation. And the second is the regulated period expanded from being just focused on the election period to also being focused on the pre-election period. So you'll notice there are three regulated activities now under the current Canada Elections Act. There's advertising, there's what's referred to as partisan activities, and there's surveys. And we're going to walk through each one of those, and I'll explain what is and is not regulated in each one of those categories. So on the next slide, you'll notice that third parties are required to register in either the pre-election period, which has already concluded, so not so much of a concern, or in the election period. And the election period began on September 11th. And you're required to register as a third party if your organization, charity, not-for-profit incurs $500 or more in expenses on any of those three regulated activities, so advertising, partisan activities, or election surveys. So the next slide outlines advertising. And there's a key distinction here. Again, we're outside of the pre-election period, but I'll just highlight it. During the pre-election period, only partisan advertising is covered. And partisan advertising is advertising that promotes or opposes a political figure or entity. However, during the election period, so we are now in the election period, partisan advertising is covered, but issues-based advertising is also covered. So if you are promoting or opposing an issue in an advertisement that's associated with a political party or entity, you are also engaged in regulated activity. And now you might be asking on the next page, the next slide, what does it mean to promote or oppose a political party? And what does it mean to promote or oppose an issue associated with a political party? And Elections Canada has offered us guidance on this. So to promote or oppose a political figure or entity can include naming that figure entity, identifying them using a logo, using photos, cartoons, etc. But it also includes linking to a website that promotes or opposes. So if I have an advertisement, let's take a billboard, for example, or a television advertisement, and that advertisement itself does not talk about issues or does not talk about political parties or candidates, it will still be regulated if it contains a link to a website that eventually talks about parties or issues. Okay? And what does it mean to promote an issue associated with a political party or a candidate? Well, Elections Canada has essentially said any issue that is talked about in the election, okay, on social media, in a platform, in debates, is an issue associated. So our advice to clients is if you're advertising on issues during the election period, you're most likely engaging in a regulated activity. Obviously, the scope of issues that are being talked about in the campaign are very substantive. I'll switch over now. So that's advertising. On the next slide, you'll notice there's partisan activity. So we talked about advertising. You have to put money behind advertising for it to be advertising. Partisan activities are a little different. This is a new addition to the Act. It applies in the election period and in the pre-election period, and it's the same definition. So it's any activity or event that promotes or opposes a political party or candidate, okay? But it does not include an event that promotes or opposes only an issue. So on the next slide, you'll see some examples of what constitute partisan activities. Again, these are only partisan, back one slide there. These are only regulated if they are promoting or opposing a political party or candidate. Sorry, one more there, one more ahead. Right there, that's good. So making telephone calls, for example, sending emails or text messages, holding rallies or events, social media content that doesn't have placement costs, door-to-door canvassing or websites, those are all regulated as a partisan activity if they promote or oppose a party. If you're engaged in these types of things only in issues, it would not be regulated. Okay, so the next slide now. Social media is tricky because in some cases it's considered advertising, and in some cases it's considered an activity. And it depends on what you're talking about and whether you're putting money behind your social media. So if you have an example where a charity, let's say, posts a tweet about the carbon levy and rebate program, okay, and it doesn't pay to boost or advertise the tweet, so there's no advertising dollars behind it, and it doesn't contain a link to a website that would talk about other things such as a political party or platform, that would not be regulated. Okay, it would not meet the definition of advertising because it has no placement costs, and it would not meet the definition of a partisan activity because it doesn't promote or oppose a political party. Okay, the next example is, let's say a charity posts a tweet about the carbon levy and rebate program, and they pay Twitter to boost that tweet or to advertise it. Okay, that would be regulated in the election period. You've now incurred a placement cost. You've now engaged in advertising, and issues advertising is covered during the election period. Okay, the third example, a charity posts a tweet about defeating a political party, okay, and you don't pay to boost it. Now, this is where the new category comes in. Because it's partisan, even though you didn't incur a placement cost, it's still regulated. It's regulated as a partisan activity because it promotes or opposes a political party. And the last example is a charity posting a tweet talking about defeating a political party or candidate, and they pay to boost it. It's regulated, but it's regulated as advertising because you've incurred a placement cost. So social media, You should be engaged on social media, but there are some social media posts that would be regulated from the Canada election standpoint. The next slide, so we've talked about advertising and activities. The final category of regulated activities is election surveys or polling. And election surveys are in and of themselves not regulated, but if you use an election survey in either the pre-election period or the election period to craft advertising, to influence a message, or to decide whether or not to engage in a regulated activity, it would be regulated. So if your organization conducts a poll, that's not enough to be regulated. If your organization conducts a poll and then you use the data in a subsequent advertisement or a subsequent social media post, that would be regulated. So again, just a reminder on the next slide, you're required to register if you incur $500 or more in expenses on any of those three regulated activities. So partisan activities, advertising, which includes issues advertising, and election surveys. The next slide, I just want to point out a few things with expenses. So labor is an expense unless it is volunteer labor. Expenses can include existing content. So if you developed existing content and you subsequently advertise it, for example, that would be covered as well. Just conscious of the timing here, I'm going to skip through the next couple of slides here a little bit quicker. The next slide is just the spending limits. We're now in the election period, so you'll notice that the national spending limit is $511,000. The riding level spending limit is $4,386. Okay, that's the maximum amount you can spend on regulated activities. The next slide, once you register, you have to be aware that there are a number of ongoing compliance issues. Okay, you have to disclose your donors and your expenses. You have to appoint an auditor if you incur $10,000 or more in expenses. And there's certain requirements related to labeling. So if you're going to purchase a television advertisement, for example, you need to put language on there that says it was authorized by your financial agent, etc. The next slide here, one big no-no is third parties are not allowed to accept foreign contributions. That includes individuals who are not Canadian citizens or are not permanent residents, and it also includes donations from companies that do not normally carry on business in Canada. And the final two slides I'll skip over pretty quickly here, but there are provisions in the Act that prevent third parties from colluding with political parties. So if you're going to engage in a regulated activity, you can't be discussing that regulated activity with a political party or a candidate or someone that's employed by the party, etc. Okay, and there are also restrictions on two third parties colluding with each other for the purposes of avoiding the expense limits. Enforcement, okay, you want to take necessary steps to make sure you're compliant with the law, but there are enforcement mechanisms if entities aren't in compliance, and that includes compliance agreements as well as some administrative monetary penalties, and in the worst case scenario, potential court-based actions. I'll just skip over the last slide there because I'm conscious of time, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Kyle. And that's really important and really helpful to see what we need to be following under the Elections Canada Act. Also really bonus points for getting all of that information in 11 minutes. So thank you very much. It's a lot that you covered, but really helpful in how you covered it and making sure that we're aware of the three activities and what falls under each. So thank you very much. And now on to time to advocate with Bill. So I'll turn it over to Bill now to talk about what we can do this election period. What some ideas. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Sarah. And there will be some repetition here of some of the points that have already been raised, but we think it's important to put some of this stuff in context in that way to get the message through. And also there are some key differences in how the various regimes apply to nonprofits versus registered charities. So we'll tease some of those out here as well. So if we can get the next slide. Okay, so first there, when we're talking about advocacy, I mean, there are things that as a charity or a nonprofit you can do at any time. Meeting with elected officials, having them attend events that you're hosting, running campaigns to increase awareness of issues, to be urging government action on things, responding to government consultations. If the government is asking for people's views on things, you can provide those views. The slide seems to have gone forward here. Anyway, the slides seem to be advancing on my screen here.
Sorry, Bill, we're just going to fix that. Just a technical glitch there. There we go. Yeah, we'll get that up and running. Sorry about that.
I know we're limited for time, but I can't talk.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I said I could make sure we were on time, but I'm not rushing you that way. Let me just load it up again. Sorry, everyone. Okay, let's go back. Okay, and there we go.
Back one more. Yeah. Yeah, so responding to government consultations, I mean, if a committee's holding a hearing on something, if there's a tribunal, I mean, that is something that is completely legitimate at any time. Giving information about your positions, publishing op-eds on issues related to your mission, and using your social media platforms to share issues, stories, voices of your communities. If we go to the next slide. And during an election season, I mean, there's still a wide variety of activities you can engage in. So providing information about party platforms. I mean, when the parties are putting things out on issues related to your mission, you can share that information with people. Now, if you're a charity and you need to be nonpartisan, don't endorse any of those platform positions, but put that information out there. You can give information about how MPs have voted on a piece of legislation in the past that was important to you. But again, if you're a charity, you can't single out MPs for particular attention. You can't say these group of MPs was with us and this group of MPs was against us. You can just say, here's where we stood on this issue. Here's how all MPs voted on it. During the election, again, you can publish op-eds in the local papers on issues. You can use your social media platforms, your website, your email list to share all these pieces of information. And you can invite candidates to visit your facility or program as long as they're paying their own costs to get there. One thing you need to do, again, if you're a charity and need to remain nonpartisan, if you invite one candidate to come and tour around and meet people, make sure you invite them all. They don't all have to accept the invitation, but they all have to be given the opportunity if one is given the opportunity. And you can also host all candidates discussions and debates with, again, here, the idea being that you invite them all. If they don't all show up, that's fine. But if you've invited them all and only one shows up, well, that's bonus for them, but you've done what you're required to do. Next slide. Now, this is specific to charities because the requirements in the Income Tax Act, where they don't use the term partisan or nonpartisan, but essentially that restriction on directly or indirectly supporting a party or a candidate for office means as a charity, you can't be partisan. So what does that look like? As we've talked about, you know, giving staff paid time off to work on campaigns. And that includes, in some cases, you know, a member of your staff might be running for office. They can't be doing that while they're being paid. Using any of your resources, including your volunteers, to support or oppose a party or candidate. So don't be encouraging your volunteers to then volunteer for a particular candidate. You can't be encouraging your communities to vote for or against a party. You can't give any financial support to a party or candidate, including donations or tickets to fundraisers. And that means you can't do any of that. It's not a case of, okay, we bought a ticket to this person's fundraiser. If we buy tickets to the rest, we're okay. This is one, no financial transfers at all between the charity and a party or candidate. And you can't give unequal treatment to parties and candidates. As I just mentioned, if you invite one candidate to something, you have to invite all of them to participate. Not all at the same time, but they have to be given the same opportunity. You don't all have to accept that opportunity, but they have to be given the opportunity. We go to the next slide. And so, as I mentioned, and Terry covered this quite well as well, you know, being nonpartisan as a charity. The Income Tax Act doesn't refer to nonpartisan activities, but essentially the definition they give is about being partisan. Now, one thing that came up recently when the Elections Act got some coverage is a concern that because the Elections Act itself uses a different definition of partisan and uses the word partisan for any organization that registers, there was a concern that a charity that registers under the Elections Act is by that action being partisan. We've had clarification from the Canada Revenue Agency, from the Charities Directorate, that the mere act of a charity registering as a third party under the Elections Act does not in and of itself violate the requirements of the Income Tax Act. So registering as a third party entity, that's fine. All that CRA is concerned about is, if you've registered, are you obeying the rules under the Income Tax Act? That's all they're concerned about. They're not concerned about the Elections Act itself. And again, the Elections Act itself, the statement from the Chief Electoral Officer that it does not prevent individuals or groups from talking about any issues or publishing information during the election period. There are limited circumstances, essentially when you're paying to advertise about those issues, where you may have to register, but there is nothing preventing organizations from talking about issues during the campaign. And the next slide, please. And so again, I think we've covered most of this in terms of what it means to be nonpartisan. One thing I really want to emphasize is, if you're sharing information about the party platforms, don't do report cards, don't give letter grades, don't give percentage scores. That is something that the CRA has been very clear on, that they will see that in most cases as being indirectly supporting a party or a candidate. You can set up like a grid where it's like, here's what we think should happen on this issue. List the parties and what they say about that issue. Even if the party says nothing about that issue, you can leave that section blank. Let people draw their own conclusions. Doing letter grades, doing number grades will be seen as an attempt to sway people to vote or to not vote in a particular way. So I can't emphasize that point enough. No letter grades, no report cards, please. And if we go to the next slide. So how might some of these advertising rules look in the real world? And this here is actually an example. I met with the people at Elections Canada and asked them about these specific messages. And in the first case, you know, an environmental charity that says, think about the environment when you vote. Elections Canada indicated that is broad and general enough and a message that wouldn't trigger the requirement to register. Whereas if you ran a campaign with paid ads saying Canada needs a carbon tax, send a message with your vote, that gets into a specific enough an issue and also an issue where there's at least one party opposing a carbon tax and at least one party promoting a carbon tax. So with a case like that, you would need to register. You can still do it and you need to register, but only if you're running paid ads. If you're just using your website, your social media channels, and not paying to promote that message, you don't have to register. And again, it's not a problem for the CRA, because if you're an environmental organization and this is your mission, it's related to your purpose. If you've been active on the issue, just because your views happen to be similar to one or more parties, you can still talk about them as far as the CRA is concerned. Just don't cross that line of telling people who to vote for or not to vote for. If you're a nonprofit that isn't a charity, you don't have to worry about that aspect. So here again, an example for a nonprofit. I mean, if you're an organization that serves refugees and newcomers and you just want to promote the message that refugees are welcome, that is broad enough a message that that is not likely to trigger the need to register. But if you're running a specific paid ad campaign saying that we have to offer a safe place for all refugees, the implication being that we should not have restrictions on the numbers coming in. Again, there's at least one party known to be wanting to limit the number of refugees. So that would be specific enough that you would need, if you were running paid ads with a message like that, to register as a third-party advertiser. And if we can go to the next one.
Great. I think that's it, Bill.
And that's it for me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks very much for those examples that we can see what it's like in the real world applying those rules. And now we'll turn it over to Kate Cornell for more examples of what her organizations are doing. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I'm here today representing the Canadian Arts Coalition. We are a volunteer group, a nonpartisan volunteer group of primarily national arts service organizations. And so my full-time job is executive director of the Canadian Dance Assembly. And so I'm going to be talking about what it means for the volunteer group that is not a charity or a not-for-profit, and we do lobby, and what it's like for the National Association for Dance, the Canadian Dance Assembly, which is a registered charity. I do also want to point out that my Twitter handle is there, and hashtags that we're using to get out the vote this year are also included. So Sarah, if you want to take us to the next slide. And I'll try and move as quickly as possible so that we have time for questions. So the Canadian Arts Coalition was founded in 2005 in order to advocate for the doubling of the budget of the Canada Council for the Arts. The Canada Council is our major federal funder, and my colleagues came together to talk about that to MPs and to bureaucrats. And so we had been advocating on that issue from 2005 until 2016, when it appeared in budget 2016 with a 5-year set of investments in order to double the budget of the Canada Council for the Arts. So my first point is that advocacy takes time. You need to be patient, you need to be persistent when it comes to advocacy, but I'm also incredibly proud of the work that we've done as a group to amplify our voice, to speak with one voice, and to get many asks forward and seen in several budgets, and I'll give you some examples of that. So if you want to move to the next slide. Yeah, so our most successful, oops, back again, our most successful event during the year, we do several things during the year, is Arts Day on the Hill. Arts Day on the Hill is a lobby day. We do work with a government relations firm, a lobbying firm, Global Public Affairs, and they register which is an important distinction that we do. Our past Arts Day was very successful. We brought forward and asked for Canadian festivals and presenters to see an increase to the fund that where they receive their funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, and it appeared in budget 2019. So that was really a great sense of accomplishment, because it was about 2 years of advocacy to get that ask off the ground. As Bill had already mentioned, it included numerous meetings, it included participating in consultations, building relationships with staffers and MPs and ministers and senators. And the last push of the campaign was really exciting. We tried to reach out to because there are more than 600 organizations who are recipients in that funding program. We tried to reach out to as many of them as we could and get them to talk to their MPs. So we had meetings across the country. And then my colleague who is pictured there, Frédéric Julien of Capacoa, wrote an op-ed for Le Devoir, which was, I think, one of the turning points in getting the government to agree that we needed to see more investment in this part of the production chain. So Arts Day on the Hill is a great example of a lobby day. It's one of the biggest lobby days that Ottawa sees, where we bring artists and arts managers like myself to Ottawa to meet with all of the parties. Of course, in this picture here, I am pictured with only Liberals and members of the government, but we do meet with any representative who wants to see us from any party to talk about arts funding. So we can move forward to the next slide. What was really successful in 2015 was the fact that the arts were included in several of the platforms of the parties. Most notably, of course, it was in the Liberal Party platform, and then that became a reality. And we really feel like the doubling of the budget of the Canada Council, which was in the Liberal platform in 2015, was a goal for 2019 to get some of our asks to appear in the platforms. Of course, you all probably know that most of the platforms haven't been published yet. The Green Party platform has been, a vision document of the NDP has been published. Both include references to the arts, yay. And so what the Canadian Arts Coalition has been doing for the last 6 months or so is putting together an incredibly detailed document. This is the summary of the document, the next 2 slides, where we put forward our dreams and our hopes for all the parties to look at in terms of arts funding, cultural funding, language funding. I am particularly proud of ask number 4 here, to pursue meaningful relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and to work on the funding of Indigenous artists across this country. If you want to move to the next slide, go right ahead, Sarah. So we spent a lot of time looking at how we could get into those platforms. And of course, now that the writ has been drawn up, it's really too late to try and do that work. So I'm really, as my colleagues have already said, I'm trying to encourage you to do this work, not just during the election period, but all the time. So related to the election, what the Canadian Arts Coalition is trying to do is get out the vote. There are 726,600 arts workers in this country. There are more artists in this country than there are auto workers, and we're trying to get all of those people out to vote. And that's why we're using the hashtag #VoteArts, a bilingual hashtag. We, as Bill already pointed out, we are not endorsing any of the platforms, but we are sharing them when they are published on our website. We are also offering other resources, potential questions you can ask to candidates at the door. We're putting forward a question that hopefully will be asked in the debates, the televised debates. So getting out the vote is a concerted effort. We're also hosting very soon a strategy call weekly to connect with our colleagues in arts and culture so that we can understand what's happening across the country and can work in a more coordinated fashion. So that's just a couple of the examples of what the Canadian Arts Coalition is doing to get out the vote this election period. And then switching hats, next slide. Of course, I also am Executive Director of the Canadian Dance Assembly, which is a charity. So I just wanted to, because I saw in the survey at the beginning, many of you are already doing elections activities. So I just wanted to speak up for the small not-for-profit and charities. Canadian Dance Assembly is not registering because we don't have an advertising budget, so we will not be spending $500 on advertising. Again, as a registered NASO, we will be doing activities that promote getting out the vote. So if you want to jump to my last slide there, Sarah, I've been doing a lot of work writing op-eds and trying to get our work seen in social media as well as in traditional media. I wrote a small answer a few questions for the Philanthropist online magazine. This is an infographic we shared with the Dance Current magazine. Yesterday they published my short little article called Voting 101. So for the dance community, because we skew to the younger end in terms of demographics, I've been talking a lot about Vote Compass. And if you've never voted before and you're not sure who to vote for, participate in the Vote Compass 30 questions in that survey, and it'll give you a sense of where you stand in relationship to the parties and their vision and their platform. So that's been really important. Also, we will be trying to put together lots of images on social media and hopefully doing a couple of short videos to encourage our members to get out and vote. So suffice it to say, election period is a really exciting time for arts advocates, and there's a lot of activity going on across the country. And I'm really grateful for the other speakers and their knowledge and their expertise in guiding us on how to advocate correctly and within the rules. But I just encourage you all to get out there and encourage your friends, your neighbors, your family to vote, because it's going to be, a turnout is going to be very, very important in election 2019.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kate. And I'll just note that having those stats ready, they're certainly eye-opening. It's so great that you've got those ready and are sharing those. And that's a great example for other subsectors when we can get our hands on the data, how important that is to use. All right, thank you. Well, thanks very much to all of the presenters. And we'll turn to now some questions. And we've got one question that I want to start out with, and I'll just go to our questions right now. Thank you very much. So the first question is, I've got two questions actually. Our first question, I'll turn this over to our legal experts, probably Kyle first. A really interesting question about a provincial organization. They're incorporated, they're a nonprofit, but they're not a charity, and their membership is made up of mostly of local nonprofit charitable organizations. If this organization, as sort of an umbrella or provincial association, if they're doing activity during elections, is there a risk to their members, to these member nonprofit organizations? What would be some of the things they should keep in mind? And I'll direct that over to perhaps maybe Kyle. Does that make sense? Oh, there you go. Thanks, Kyle.
Sure. Sorry, just a couple of clicks. So I'll maybe comment. I'm not going to comment on the corporate side or the charity implications, but from an election standpoint, so it's irrelevant where your entity is based or where it is incorporated for the purposes of the Election Act. So you could have a not-for-profit organization that is incorporated in Alberta or British Columbia or Ontario. If it is engaged in regulated activities, it would need to register at the federal level. So that's the first point. Now, I think the question might be dealing with what about if we're commenting on provincial issues? So let's say we're commenting on things that the provincial government is doing or provincial policies. Our advice is that there's a risk. Sometimes provincial policy issues get discussed at a federal level. We can think about a number of things in Quebec that are going on right now with the secularism bill, for example. I think commenting on those types of issues, for example, which are the subject in a federal campaign, would be covered. The second portion of the question, which I think was about exposure to members. So it's important to remember that as a third party, you're required to disclose your donors. And so there's a potential that if a member company is donating something to a registered third party, they might be donating labor, they might be donating physical materials such as paper, they might be donating a service such as design. All of those would need to be disclosed on the third party's return. And there's a potential that if they start developing or rebroadcasting things that you have developed, that they could also themselves become engaged in a regulated activity. So if you have an advertisement or an activity that is partisan, for example, and they start promoting that as well, then there's a risk that the member entity might have to register as well. So I hope I answered the question there.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks very much, Kyle. And going to our next question, can a charity critique and analyze government policy now? So not their election platforms, but their current policy during an election period.
Okay, do you want me to handle that one, Sarah?
Sure, yeah, that sounds great, Terry.
Yeah. Okay, so commenting upon a government's policy, the ability to be able to do that does not change because we're into an election period. It's very important to make sure that there's not, because there is an election, that there's not a sort of a correlation between the government's position and the party that's running for re-election. You have to be very careful with that. And by the way, I just want to go back to what the previous question, because I think it's a very interesting one. The prohibition activities for charities that you cannot support directly or indirectly, political party or candidate for office, would need to be, I think, considered here, because if the membership in the nonprofit organization involves prohibited activities, then the reference in the Income Tax Act about indirect support or opposition would need to be carefully looked at. So the long and short of it is, a registered charity being a member of an organization which is involved in activities, you need to monitor what that organization is doing so that your charity doesn't become involved in, perceived by CRA as being directly or indirectly involved in supporting or opposing political party or candidate. So just watch for that one. It just adds a little complexity there.
Great, thank you very much, Terry. And just two quick questions before we wrap up. This is a really good one, I think, to be clear about parties. Can you clarify how many of the parties a charity would need to include? For example, does this include Greens and the People's Party?
Do you want me to take that one, sir? Maybe Bill wants to add on to that as well. Well, you should try to invite all the parties if you can. The fact that not all of them want to participate in whatever debate or discussion that you have, I don't think you can control that. But what you don't want to do is sort of limit yourself to maybe just one or two parties. You want to make sure that the invitation is out to all of them and try to encourage as many of them to participate as possible.
Yeah, and I just add to that if you're talking about something that's happening in a constituency and you're inviting local candidates, you don't have to. I mean, if you're in Alberta, you don't have to try to find a bloc representative. It's the parties, the candidates that are running in your area that have to be concerned about. So if there's no candidate for a party, you don't have to worry about those parties.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Great, thank you. Thank you to you both. And as we get to 1 o'clock, thank you so much to all of our presenters. Thank you, Bill and Terry, Kate and Kyle for your information and for answering questions. We have a few more that came up and we can send those answers to you. But thank you everyone so much for your support. And we'll have a whole bunch of resources to share with you from all of these great organizations in your follow-up email, along with the slide deck as well, which is certainly jam-packed with good information. Thanks everyone. Look forward to seeing you at our next webinar and hopefully at our next our conference in November. Thanks and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.